History Secrets.
One of the most provocative claims in the history of religions is the following: Jesus may not have founded Christianity. According to this interpretation, the true founder of institutional Christianity would have been Paul of Tarsus. This idea arises in academic and historical debates about how religions transform over time, and it raises a fundamental question. What was the original message of Jesus, really? Some scholars suggest that the teachings of Jesus had characteristics close to ancient mystical traditions, especially currents that we now call Gnostic. Gnosticism was not a single organized religion. It was a set of spiritual movements that emphasized inner knowledge. The word gnosis means exactly that: deep or spiritual knowledge. According to this view, many religious traditions operated on different levels of teaching: a public layer, an inner layer, and a secret layer. The public layer contained moral teachings accessible to everyone, messages about compassion, forgiveness, and justice. In the canonical Gospels, we find many of these messages. For example, the Sermon on the Mount: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." These words present a radical ethic. They value humility, generosity, and care for the marginalized. But some ancient texts suggest that there were also deeper teachings intended for close disciples. Among these texts is the so-called Gospel of Thomas, a manuscript discovered in 1945 in the region of Nag Hammadi in Egypt. This document is part of a collection of Gnostic writings that offer different interpretations of the teachings of Jesus. One of the most well-known sayings from this gospel states, "There is a light within the human being, and if this light shines, it will illuminate the world." This language suggests a spiritual vision based on inner transformation, the idea that each person carries a divine spark. According to Gnostic traditions, knowledge of this spark would allow the individual to transcend material reality. Many of these ideas have parallels with ancient philosophies, such as Platonism, and also with Eastern spiritual traditions. In some versions of Gnostic thought, the material universe is seen as imperfect, or even as the result of a cosmic error. In these narratives, there is a supreme divine principle, called by some texts the monad or the one. From this principle emerge different levels of spiritual reality. According to certain Gnostic interpretations, the material world would have been created by an imperfect entity, sometimes called the demiurge. This entity would not fully understand the higher divine reality, and therefore would create a world marked by suffering and imperfection. Within this world, however, human beings would carry fragments of the original divine light. The spiritual mission would be to recognize this inner light, and to seek knowledge that allows a return to divine reality. In this context, Jesus could be interpreted as a spiritual teacher who came to reveal this knowledge. His parables and teachings could then be seen as symbolic clues for this inner awakening. But this interpretation represents only one of many ways to understand the history of early Christianity. Over the first centuries, different Christian communities developed distinct interpretations of the message of Jesus. Some emphasized inner spiritual knowledge. Others emphasized faith, redemption, and salvation. Gradually, One of these interpretations became dominant, the one associated with the writings of Paul and the theology developed by the early Christian churches. This tradition emphasized that Jesus died to redeem the sins of humanity, and that his resurrection offered salvation to all who believed. Over the centuries, this view became the core of institutional Christianity. Meanwhile, many Gnostic movements were considered heretical, and their texts disappeared or were preserved only in small circles. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in the 20th century rekindled academic interest in these forgotten traditions. Today, scholars continue to debate how these different movements contributed to the formation of Christianity. This debate reveals something important about the history of religions. They rarely emerge fully formed and defined. They evolve, they transform, and they reflect theological, cultural, and political debates of each era. For this reason, understanding the origins of Christianity involves analyzing multiple traditions, multiple texts, and multiple interpretations. And perhaps this diversity reveals something essential about the human spiritual quest itself, a continuous search for meaning, for truth, and for a deeper understanding of reality. Regardless of specific interpretations, the teachings attributed to Jesus continue to inspire millions of people around the world. Whether through compassion, forgiveness, or the search for inner transformation, these values remain central in many spiritual traditions to this day. To understand how these ideas evolved, it is necessary to observe the historical context in which Jesus lived. The region of Judea, in the 1st century, was under the control of the Roman Empire. This was a period of intense political and religious tension. Various Jewish groups competed for spiritual authority. Among them were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Each group had different interpretations of religious law and the future of the Jewish people. At the same time, many Jews believed that the world was approaching a profound transformation. They expected the arrival of a Messiah, a figure who would restore justice and liberate the people. In this environment of apocalyptic expectation, preachers and prophets frequently appeared. Some announced religious reforms. Others preached political change. Jesus appears in this context as an itinerant teacher, someone who taught through parables, simple stories with deep meanings. His teachings attracted followers, but also aroused suspicion among religious authorities. In addition, any popular movement could be seen by the Romans as a potential political threat. For this reason, religious leaders and Roman authorities often reacted quickly to figures considered agitators. According to traditional accounts, Jesus was arrested in Jerusalem, tried, and sentenced to crucifixion. Crucifixion was a punishment reserved by the Roman Empire for serious crimes, especially rebellion or threat to public order. But something unexpected happened after his death. Instead of disappearing, the memory of Jesus began to expand. His followers began to spread his teachings, and to interpret his death as an event of deep spiritual meaning. In many cases, the execution of a religious leader can strengthen the impact of his message. Martyrdom transforms the executed figure into a symbol of injustice, of courage, or of spiritual revelation. This phenomenon has occurred many times throughout history. When an authority attempts to silence a dissident voice, it may end up amplifying its influence. After the death of Jesus, different communities began to interpret his life and teachings in various ways. Some emphasized his role as a spiritual teacher. Others emphasized his role as a redemptive Messiah. Among the most important figures in this process was Paul of Tarsus, a missionary who traveled extensively throughout the Roman world. Paul reinterpreted the message of Jesus for a broader audience, including people who did not belong to the Jewish tradition. His writings emphasized the idea of universal salvation, the belief that the death and resurrection of Jesus offered redemption to all humanity. These ideas became central to the Christian theology that would develop in the following centuries. Gradually, Christian communities organized texts considered authoritative. These texts would form what we now know as the New Testament. Other writings, such as many Gnostic texts, ended up outside the official canon. Even so, these texts preserve alternative perspectives on the early centuries of Christianity and help historians understand the diversity of ideas present in that period. The process of forming an institutional religion involves choices, theological debates, and disputes of interpretation. Over time, some interpretations become predominanter, while others remain as parallel traditions. In the case of Christianity, the interpretation that emphasizes redemption through faith became dominant too. This view shaped churches, doctrines, and institutions over 2,000 years. But contemporary interest in Gnostic texts shows that many questions remain open. Questions about the original meaning of Jesus' teachings, about how different communities understood his message, and about how religious ideas evolve over time. These discussions do not diminish the historical or spiritual importance of Christianity. On the contrary, they reveal the richness and complexity of its origins. Because every religious tradition is also a human story, a story of search, of interpretation, and of transformation over the centuries. Perhaps it is precisely this capacity for adaptation that allows religions to continue influencing societies for so many centuries. And perhaps that is why the figure of Jesus continues to be an object of study, reflection, and inspiration in different cultures and traditions around the world. This was just one of the many enigmas that have crossed the centuries. Around the world, there are lost cities, indecipherable manuscripts, and historical events that still challenge our understanding. Some of these mysteries have begun to be revealed. Others remain completely unexplained. And in the next documentary, we will explore one of these enigmas that continues to intrigue historians to this day. Because when it comes to the history of humanity, there is always a new secret waiting to be discovered. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History Secrets.
A curious question arises when we observe human history. How do extremely united groups emerge? Groups capable of acting with absolute discipline, and that seem to possess an almost unbreakable loyalty among their members. To explore this question, imagine a thought experiment. Imagine an isolated island. No one knows where it is, and no one can escape from it. At the center of this island, there is a relatively safe place, a protected hill, but the rest of the island is extremely dangerous. Aggressive creatures roam everywhere, and anyone who leaves the center must face them to obtain resources. Now imagine that, For some mysterious reason, 100 men appear on this island. They come from different countries. They speak different languages. They have different cultures. And they share almost nothing in common. Most of them are poor. Few have had formal education. None of them were prepared to survive in that hostile environment. And at the beginning, the situation seems completely hopeless. They cannot even communicate. They have no defined leadership. And they know that any attempt to explore the island involves extreme risks. It would be natural to imagine that this group would collapse quickly. But human history shows something surprising. In situations of extreme survival, communities can transform rapidly. And what happens in this hypothetical scenario is exactly that. The first thing that emerges is a common language. Even if each person speaks a different language, they begin to create a basic system of communication. Mixed words, gestures, simple expressions. In a short time, everyone can understand each other. Next, something even more powerful emerges. A shared narrative. Each person begins to tell their own story. Where they came from, what they lost, what they expect from the future. Over time, these individual stories begin to transform into a collective myth. A founding myth. A narrative that explains why that group exists, and why it needs to survive. In many historical cases, these myths end up taking on a spiritual dimension. The group begins to believe it has a special mission, a mission chosen by higher forces. This belief strengthens collective determination. From there, rituals emerge. Rituals serve to reinforce identity and belonging. They create emotional bonds among group members and help maintain cohesion during difficult moments. Another inevitable element appears quickly. Leadership. 100 people facing a hostile environment need someone to organize decisions. Someone who inspires trust. Someone who represents the group. Now imagine the moment when this group needs to choose a leader. An older man stands up. He has experience. He speaks well. He explains strategies to face the dangers of the island. His speech is intelligent and persuasive. But then, something unexpected happens. A young man stands up. He does not give a speech. He does not present complex plans. Instead, he does something simple. He shows his own hand. And with a knife he cuts his own skin in front of everyone. Without hesitation. Without showing fear. The gesture is silent, but it conveys a powerful message. Sacrifice. Commitment. Absolute willingness to suffer for the group. At that moment, the choice of leader becomes clear. The most eloquent man may become an advisor, but the leader will be the one who demonstrated he was willing to die for the others. This type of leadership appears repeatedly in human history. Leaders who inspire, not only through intelligence, but through their willingness to take extreme risks for the collective. Over time, this group on the island begins to change deeply. Even though they were weak at the beginning, they learned to become strong. Even though they were poor and disorganized, they learned strategy. They developed discipline, mutual trust, and an almost absolute loyalty. Gradually, something even more interesting emerges. Cohesion, a form of psychological bond so strong that the group begins to function almost like a single organism. In social psychology, this is sometimes described as a collective mind. When individuals share intense experiences over long periods, their decisions and reactions begin to align. They begin to anticipate each other's behavior. Think of a highly trained sports team. Players seem to anticipate the movements of their teammates. Passes happen without verbal communication. Everyone seems to act in perfect synchrony. This synchronicity does not arise by chance. It is born from deep trust, shared training, and experiences built over time. In extreme situations, this bond can become even stronger. Soldiers in combat often report this type of connection. They can perceive the emotional state of their companions almost instantly. Now imagine a scenario of danger on the island. One of the group members goes out to gather wood. He moves far away from the camp, and then he is attacked. Perhaps he is too far away to shout, but his companions may sense that something is wrong. A feeling, a premonition. This experience is often compared to the bond between parents and children. Many mothers report feeling when something is wrong with their children, even when they are in another country. If this community on the island remains together for years, its cohesion can become extraordinary. Each member learns to fully trust the others, and when the moment of extreme danger arrives, difficult decisions can happen instantly. Imagine that a group is fleeing from dangerous creatures. They cross an improvised bridge. 9 manage to cross, but the 10th realizes something terrible. If the creatures cross the bridge, everyone will die. So he makes a decision. He cuts the rope of the bridge, knowing that this means his own death. This type of sacrifice appears repeatedly in history. Soldiers who throw themselves onto grenades to save their companions. People who risk their own lives to protect the group. When a community lives through experiences like this for years, its collective identity becomes extremely powerful. And now imagine the end of this thought experiment. After 20 years surviving together on the island, everyone is mysteriously transported back to the real world. They return to their old lives, but they carry something that no one else has. A shared experience, a deep identity, a network of absolute loyalty. Naturally, these people would seek each other out again. They would gather their children. They would pass on their stories. They would preserve their rituals. Over time, this network could grow. Their descendants would inherit not only wealth or social position, but also a secret culture of cohesion and loyalty. And this is where the provocative question arises. What if many powerful groups in history emerged from similar experiences? Extreme experiences that created highly united communities. Secret societies, initiatory orders, elite groups. Perhaps they all began in the same way. Small groups that went through intense trials, and that developed absolute trust among their members. If this hypothesis is correct, it helps explain why certain groups seem to exert influence for generations, because their strength is not only in wealth or power, but in something deeper: cohesion, loyalty, and collective identity. The island theory does not intend to claim that a specific secret society rules the world. It proposes something simpler, a way to understand how extremely united human groups can emerge. History shows that small communities with strong cohesion can exert disproportionate influence, even when they are numerically small, because their strength is not only in material resources, but in absolute trust among their members. Think of elite military orders. Think of academic fraternities. Think of ancient religious brotherhoods. All these groups share something in common: rituals, founding narratives, and transformative experiences that create deep loyalty. This loyalty allows the group to function almost like a single organism. Decisions can be made quickly, information flows with trust, and strategies are executed with discipline. This does not necessarily mean that these groups conspire to dominate the world, but it does mean they may possess important advantages: coordination, trust, and continuity across generations. Many historical elites emerged in this way. Small circles that shared similar education, similar experiences, similar values. Over time, these networks became extremely influential. Prestigious universities, military institutions, initiatory orders, all function, in a sense, as communities of trust. The island theory suggests that this type of network can be born from extreme situations: wars, exiles, deep crises, moments when small groups need to fully trust one another to survive. When these experiences occur, something powerful emerges: a collective identity, a shared narrative, a common culture. This culture may include symbols, stories, ceremonies, and even unique languages that only members fully understand. These elements create an extremely strong sense of belonging, stronger, at times, than ordinary family ties, stronger than temporary political alliances. And when this type of bond spans generations, it becomes tradition. Children inherit not only assets, but also an identity, a mission, a worldview. That is why many ancient organizations have complex initiation rituals. They do not serve only as symbolic ceremonies. They recreate, in a controlled way, transformative experiences. Experiences that bring new members closer to the original culture of the group. These rituals may include challenges, trials, moments of vulnerability. All of this helps reinforce mutual trust. When someone goes through an intense experience alongside other members, the psychological bond strengthens. This is a dynamic recognized in various fields of social psychology. But the island theory also raises a deeper question. What truly defines leadership? In the island thought experiment, the leader was not chosen for his intelligence, nor for his eloquence. He was chosen for demonstrating sacrifice, for showing that he was willing to suffer for the group. This display of commitment created instant trust. Throughout history, many leaders emerged in the same way. They gained followers not only through ideas, but through courage, through personal example, through a willingness to take risks. This type of leadership inspires something powerful: devotion. When followers believe their leader shares their sacrifices, loyalty strengthens. And this loyalty can sustain entire communities, social movements, religious orders, revolutionary groups. The island theory, therefore, is not just a reflection on secret societies. It is a reflection on human nature, on how communities are formed, and on how loyalty and identity can shape history. At its core, it suggests something simple. In moments of crisis, small groups can transform in extraordinary ways. They can develop bonds so strong that they survive for generations. These bonds can build institutions, they can shape cultures, and sometimes they can even influence the destiny of entire societies. Perhaps that is why stories of fraternities, secret orders, and invisible elites continue to fascinate so many people. They reflect a deep intuition, the intuition that behind the visible structures of society, there are invisible human networks. Networks of trust, of shared memory, of collective identity. And if the island theory is at least partially correct, then many of these networks may have emerged in the same way. Small groups, great trials, and a silent promise to remain united. In the end, perhaps the true secret of these communities is not power, but something much simpler: loyalty, trust, and the human ability to create meaning even in the most difficult situations. Because when people face the impossible together, they rarely return the same. And sometimes, those changes end up shaping the world in ways that few can perceive. The history of humanity is a journey, filled with discoveries, enigmas, and mysteries. Some have been understood, others still challenge our understanding. And it is precisely in these mysteries that we find the most fascinating questions. Subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the secrets of history. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.
History secrets.
There comes a moment in history when an empire stops acting with strategy and begins to act on impulse. That is exactly what many analysts believe is happening with the United States. The idea that everything can return to what it once was, to the 2020 scenario, is no longer sustainable. Even if there are internal political changes, the imperial logic tends to remain. Because this is not just about governments, but about structural interests. And in this new scenario, something fundamental begins to break. The relationship with allies. For decades, the United States sustained its global influence, not only through military force, but through the construction of strategic alliances. These alliances were based on common interests, even if they were often justified by shared values. Now that logic seems to be dissolving. Instead of strategy, ideology emerges. Instead of geopolitical calculation, impulsive decisions appear, driven by appearance and displays of power. And this has consequences. One of the most evident is the growing perception that American power is no longer expanding, but retracting. What we are seeing is not just a more aggressive use of force, but a change in behavior. An empire that once avoided direct action, preferring indirect influence, now begins to act explicitly, almost theatrically. One example often cited is the operation in Venezuela. The capture of a head of state, the public display of him as a political trophy, and the destruction of national symbols were not merely military acts. They were gestures loaded with meaning. Gestures that, instead of consolidating power, may be destroying bridges irreversibly. Because there is an unwritten rule in geopolitics. You may overthrow a government, but you cannot humiliate a nation without paying the price. By abducting and exposing a leader, the target is not only the individual, it is the people he represents. It is the national identity itself. And that generates something far more dangerous than political resistance. It generates collective resentment. This type of action marks an important rupture. For decades, the United States avoided this kind of direct approach precisely because it understood the consequences. It preferred to operate behind the scenes, influence elites, finance internal changes, shape narratives. It was the so-called soft power. Bribery, diplomacy, propaganda, infiltration. Silent tools, but extremely effective. But now, that logic seems to have been abandoned. In its place comes the need to demonstrate strength in a visible way, to create images that reinforce the idea of dominance, to turn geopolitical actions into spectacles. And it is exactly there that many analysts identify a historical pattern. Empires on the rise think long-term. Empires in decline think about immediate impact. When an empire begins to sacrifice strategy for appearance, that usually indicates something deeper: the loss of self-control, the loss of the ability to foresee, and perhaps more importantly, the loss of humility, because arrogance is often the final stage before collapse. And this pattern is not new. Throughout history, empires in decline do not only confront their enemies, they begin to antagonize their own allies. They start exploiting those they once protected. The result is predictable: isolation, and eventually, global resistance. In the short term, these actions may seem effective. They may convey a sense of absolute control. They may create the impression that power is still unquestionable. But, in the long term, they plant the seeds of something much greater: a coordinated reaction, a movement of opposition that does not appear immediately, but grows silently. And when that movement finally manifests, it is too late to contain it. There is a concept used by some thinkers to describe this kind of behavior: micro-militarism. The idea is simple, but deeply revealing. When an empire begins to lose its global position, it starts seeking quick victories against smaller targets. Not because this changes the real balance of power, but because it helps preserve the image of strength. It is a form of compensation, an attempt to hide decline through visible demonstrations of dominance. And in that context, actions such as intervention in Venezuela take on a new meaning. They are not merely isolated strategic decisions. They are symptoms of a larger pattern. A pattern in which appearance becomes more important than consequence. Because from a strictly geopolitical point of view, the logic raises questions. Even if a leader is unpopular, he still represents a sovereign state. And by acting against him in that way, the impact goes far beyond any individual evaluation. The message being sent is not about one ruler. It is about all the countries that are watching. In South America, this type of action tends to produce a specific effect: unification. Countries that historically have deep differences may, when faced with a common external threat, find a point of convergence. Distrust grows, perception changes, and what was once seen as a stabilizing power begins to be seen as an agent of instability. That changes the entire game, because alliances are not built only on economic interests. They depend on trust, and trust, once broken, is rarely restored. At the same time, this shift is not limited to South America. It reverberates globally. Africa, Europe, Asia. Each region observes, interprets, and adjusts its own strategies. And little by little, a new narrative forms: that the United States no longer operates as a global leader, but as an unpredictable actor. And unpredictability, on the international stage, is a risk factor, because it forces all other actors to prepare for the worst. This accelerates a process that was already underway: the gradual distancing. Countries begin to diversify their alliances, reduce dependencies, seek alternatives. And once that movement begins, it is rarely reversed. There is also an important psychological element in this process: the way decisions are made. According to the analysis presented, there is a significant difference between understanding reality and trying to shape it through perception. In some cases, leadership begins to operate as if creating a convincing narrative were enough to make it true, as if repetition and exposure were sufficient to transform an idea into concrete reality. That logic may work in controlled environments, on television, in domestic politics, but on the international stage, it runs into limits, because there are factors that cannot be ignored: geography, resources, military capacity, national interests, and above all, the reaction of other actors. Ignoring these variables does not eliminate their existence. It only increases the risk of error. And when those errors occur on a global scale, their consequences are not isolated. They accumulate, they amplify, and eventually they become impossible to control. It is at this point that a central question arises: to what extent are these decisions part of a larger strategy, or the result of a distorted vision of reality? The answer is not simple, but the signs are beginning to become more evident. The idea that removing one leader is enough to completely transform a country, as if the structure of a nation were concentrated in a single figure, as if eliminating that element would cause the whole system to collapse automatically. But reality is usually more complex. States are not just leaders. They are institutions, culture, collective identity, structures of power that go far beyond one individual. And when that complexity is ignored, the result rarely follows the original plan. In the case being analyzed, this logic seems to have been taken to the extreme. The capture of a head of state was not followed by a structured transition. There was no clear replacement. There was no consistent plan for reorganization. The implicit expectation was that everything would simply collapse. But that raises an inevitable question: what happens when the system does not collapse? The answer, many times, is prolonged instability, because removing the top without reorganizing the base creates a vacuum. And vacuums, in international politics, rarely remain empty for long. They are filled by internal disputes, by external forces, by conflicts that intensify precisely because of the absence of central control. And that turns a one-time action into a continuous problem. At the same time, another element is being discussed: the way leadership perceives its own power. There is a view according to which demonstrating strength visibly is enough to guarantee obedience, as if psychological impact could replace the need for structure. This logic, however, depends on a specific condition: that other actors accept that display as legitimate. But when that does not happen, the effect can be exactly the opposite. Instead of submission, resistance emerges. Instead of alignment, opposition emerges. And that completely redefines the scenario. There is also an interesting analogy that helps explain this behavior: the comparison with the world of entertainment. The idea that political actions can be conducted like high-visibility events, where immediate impact matters more than long-term consistency. In that context, decisions are made not only for their real effect, but for the way they will be perceived, for the visual impact, for the narrative that will be built. But there is a clear limit to this approach. Because the real world does not respond like a script, there is no absolute control over reactions. There is no guarantee that the narrative will be accepted. And when that gap between perception and reality becomes too large, errors begin to accumulate. Trust declines, and the room for maneuver shrinks rapidly. This brings us to a critical point in the analysis: the distinction between real power and perceived power. An empire may seem strong, while its foundations are weakening. It may display control, while silently losing influence. And that difference is not always visible in the short term, but over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. As this scenario develops, another layer of the analysis begins to emerge: the simultaneous expansion of conflicts, not in one single point, but in multiple regions at the same time. Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, Asia. Military presence intensifies, operations multiply, and the logic that seems to guide these actions is the same: expand influence before a decisive moment. That moment, according to the analysis presented, would have a specific milestone: a direct negotiation with China. But to reach that point with an advantage, it would be necessary to consolidate power in other regions, demonstrate control, create a position of strength that could be used as a bargaining chip. And that explains the acceleration, because it is not only about acting, but about acting fast. Within that logic, the so-called Global South assumes a central role. Controlling that region would mean influencing strategic resources, trade routes, and emerging alliances, and at the same time, directly pressuring rival powers. But there is a structural problem in this approach. Every action generates a reaction, and the greater the number of open fronts, the greater the complexity of management. This leads us to a classic concept in geopolitics: imperial overstretch. An empire may possess great military power, but that does not mean it can sustain multiple simultaneous conflicts without consequences. Resources are finite, strategic attention is limited, and above all, exhaustion accumulates. It is at this point that one of the most unpredictable elements in the entire equation comes in: China's response. Unlike other powers, China operates with multiple internal currents of strategic thought. There is not one single dominant vision, but a spectrum of possibilities being constantly debated. Some defend closer alignment with Russia. Others prefer a more balanced position, avoiding excessive dependence on either side. And this internal division makes any prediction extremely uncertain, because the final decision will not be only externally. It will also be the result of internal disputes, economic evaluations, risk calculations, and a reading of the global scenario at the exact moment. This means the outcome is not predetermined, but the impact of the decision will be, because regardless of the choice, it will directly influence the coming years, perhaps even the next decade. There is, however, one possibility being raised: that a major agreement may be reached. An agreement that, at first glance, could suggest stability, but that in practice would not alter the main trajectory, because agreements do not eliminate structural tensions. They only reorganize them, and in some cases they even intensify them silently. This creates a paradoxical situation. Even with negotiations, even with apparent diplomatic progress, the global system may continue moving toward conflict, not because of a specific failure, but because of structural incompatibility. And when systems enter into conflict at that level, the consequences are not localized, they are global. Within this dynamic, there is one point that stands out as a possible center of convergence: Iran. Throughout the analysis, it appears not merely as another point of tension, but as a final strategic objective, a point where multiple lines of conflict may intersect. And that completely changes the level of risk. Because unlike other scenarios, an escalation in Iran would not be isolated. It would directly involve other powers: Russia, possibly China, and various regional actors with deeply rooted interests. There is a fundamental difference between limited operations and large-scale invasions. Airstrikes can have impact. They can weaken structures, but they can hardly completely alter a regime. A ground invasion, on the other hand, requires something much greater: massive resources, extended logistics, and the willingness to sustain a conflict for an indefinite period. In the case of Iran, this complexity multiplies. The country has a significant population, a difficult geography, and a military capacity that cannot be ignored. That makes any attempt at direct intervention extremely risky. But even so, the possibility is considered, not necessarily through traditional strategic logic, but through a combination of factors: external pressures, political interests, and above all, the search for immediate gains. There is also a less visible, but equally important component in the process of indirect preparation. Before any large-scale action, an intensification of internal movements can be observed: protests, economic instability, support for dissident groups, covert operations. These elements do not confirm an imminent intervention, but they indicate an environment being shaped, a scenario being prepared, and that reinforces the perception that the conflict, if it occurs, will not be sudden. It will be the result of a gradual construction. At the same time, a critical question arises: the moment of decision. If an action of this magnitude is to be taken, when will it happen? According to the analysis, 2026 may represent a phase of acceleration, a period in which tensions increase, movements intensify, and positions are defined. But the climax may lie beyond that, perhaps in 2027. This distinction is important, because it indicates that not all decisive events occur immediately after their preparation. Some require maturation, alignment of factors, and often a specific window of opportunity. All of this leads us to a provisional conclusion. The global scenario is not merely transforming, it is compressing. Events that once would have taken years to unfold now seem to happen in much shorter cycles. Decisions accumulate, consequences overlap, and the margin for error decreases drastically. In this kind of environment, small decisions can generate disproportionate effects, and major decisions can completely redefine the global balance. As these tensions accumulate, another aspect begins to gain relevance: the way power is exercised, not only in concrete actions, but in the logic behind them. There is a reading according to which strategic decisions may be guided less by structured analysis, and more by immediate perception, by image, by impact, as if the main objective were to demonstrate strength, regardless of the long-term consequences. And that creates a dangerous misalignment, because the exercise of power requires consistency. It requires a minimum degree of predictability. It requires an understanding of limitations. Without that, what remains is improvisation. One of the most critical points in this analysis lies in the idea of overload. Opening multiple fronts of action at the same time may seem, at first, like a demonstration of dominance, but in practice, it tends to generate the opposite effect: dispersion of resources, difficulty of coordination, increased risk of errors, and above all, continuous wear. In history, this pattern repeats itself. Empires that expand beyond their capacity to sustain themselves end up entering a cycle of progressive weakening, not because of an initial lack of power, but because of the inability to manage that power efficiently. There is also a diplomatic factor that cannot be ignored: trust. International relations depend, to a great extent, on consistency. When a country constantly alternates between rapprochement and confrontation, between cooperation and threat, it becomes difficult to interpret, and over time, it stops being taken seriously. Partners hesitate, adversaries adapt, and the space for real negotiations shrinks. This does not mean that influence disappears immediately, but it becomes unstable. An unstable influence is, by definition, fragile. Within this context, an interesting comparison arises. The idea that leadership operates as a structure guided by its own interests, closer to a transactional logic than an institutional one. Decisions begin to be evaluated not only by their collective impact, but by individual benefit, by immediate advantage, by the capacity to generate specific gains, even if temporary. This approach can produce quick results, but it rarely builds stability, because stability requires long-term commitment. It requires alignment between discourse and action. It requires mutual trust, and these elements cannot be replaced by isolated demonstrations of force. The result is an increasingly unpredictable environment, where every move needs to be constantly reevaluated, where alliances become volatile, and where the risk of escalation remains always present. This leads us to a broader perception. The international system may be entering a phase of transition, a period in which old structures cease to function, but new ones have not yet been fully defined. And periods of transition are, historically, the most unstable, because it is in them that the rules change. And when the rules change, the behavior of actors changes as well. If there is a point where all these lines converge, it may be closer than it seems. Not necessarily in a single isolated event, but in a sequence of decisions that, together, define a new direction. Throughout the analysis, one specific moment is highlighted: a meeting, a negotiation, a point at which two major powers may redefine, even if temporarily, the global balance. But what is really at stake in this kind of meeting? At first glance, the idea of an agreement may suggest stability, the perception that tensions can be reduced, that interests can be aligned, that conflicts can be avoided. But in complex scenarios, agreements are rarely definitive solutions. They are adjustments, reorganizations, redistributions of influence, and often they merely postpone conflicts that remain latent, because the structural causes remain present: competition for resources, disputes over influence, ideological differences, and above all, interests that are not fully compatible. There is a metaphor that helps illustrate this kind of situation. When great forces begin to move, the impact does not remain limited to them. Everything around them is affected. Even when there is cooperation, the effect on others can be equally profound, because the system is not static. It reacts, it adapts, and in some cases it suffers the consequences without directly participating in the decisions. This raises an important reflection. What happens to those who are not at the center of these negotiations? Smaller nations, peripheral regions, societies that are often affected without having influence over the process. The answer is not simple, but history suggests a pattern. In moments of global reconfiguration, the effects tend to spread unevenly. Some grow stronger, others become more vulnerable, and many simply need to adapt quickly in order to survive. Returning to the broader scenario, a conclusion begins to take shape. The world is not merely moving toward a possible conflict. It is undergoing a structural transformation, a rearrangement of forces, a redefinition of roles. And this kind of transformation does not happen in a linear way. It involves advances and retreats, agreements and ruptures, moments of stability followed by new tensions. Given all this, perhaps the most relevant question is not to predict exactly what will happen, but to understand the type of process that is underway. A process in which short-term decisions may generate long-term consequences, in which the appearance of strength may hide internal fragilities, and in which the speed of events reduces the capacity for correction. In the end, the analysis does not point to a single certainty, but to a set of possibilities, scenarios that depend on choices not yet made, on responses not yet defined, and on factors that remain in motion. Perhaps the true turning point does not lie in one single event, but in the sum of all of them, in the way they connect, in the way they amplify one another, and in the moment when they cease to be reversible. Because when that moment arrives, history can no longer go back. Each historical discovery reveals new clues, but also raises new questions. Because when it comes to the past, there is always something we still do not understand. Because some secrets of history are still waiting to be revealed.